Time.
And that's the time.
You are quick.
I'm working on it. Calling Chris Anderson in where? Where are you?
Hot dog. I'm in Studio W2. So I am in Windsor.
Wow. The studio designations come thick there from Windsor, don't they?
They move quite a bit, yes, even here in Windsor.
Okay.
And you are back in the
back
Holy of Holies, huh?
in Chicago in the same old spot, and I'm here I think for like 5 or 6 weeks. I'm going to be from here, and you've just been traveling, right? You just got back.
Yeah, I was in Normandy for 10 days, and then I came home, and then I went up to the Peak District. And I carved wooden spoons with my daughter for 4 days. It was great.
Fantastic. So now your family no longer has to eat with your hands.
Well, I don't know that I successfully completed any, but I still do have all my fingers. Yes.
Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. And check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And, Chris, whether people are watching live or watching later on replay, or maybe they're listening on the HHH
podcast.
Oh, yeah, very nice. We're glad that you're here. And today we're going to be talking about the Manhattan Project and the bombing of Japan, the atomic bomb, which took place 80 years ago on Wednesday, was the first one. If you're here with us, let us know what you're drinking. And Chris, we should thank everybody who
we absolutely should,
who joins us, joins us as a Top Shelf patron or any kind of patron through patreon.com. And you can join this group by clicking on patreon.com/history happy hour. I think I have this updated now.
I think you do. And I think more people need to join because poor Susan is hanging on there. She's like hanging at the end of the chain.
Right.
And we don't want her out there all by herself.
So do we need somebody with a last name beginning with Z to join, or can it be just anybody?
I think anybody would just kind of shift everything around, so she's just not hanging out there all by herself.
And I haven't ordered more hats yet, but if you are a Top Shelf patron, you do get a hat, and it might be a few weeks before we get into that. But
now you're home doing nothing until September. That should be no problem.
Oh, I'm not doing nothing. I'm doing intense preparations for my September tour. Okay, so Chris, do we have anybody watching, or have they all left already because the conversation is so banal?
Banal. Yes, we have the Templars joining us, and Doreen is back, so we're really happy about that. Hello, Doreen. Lizzie Borden from London. Ken from Mobile. Paul Tibbetts. Hello, Paul. That's an appropriate viewer for the week.
Yes, well, I think that Paul may be the grandson. Paul, can you confirm that? Are you the Paul Tibbetts?
Tibbetts 4.
Yes, I believe he is the grandson, and he is also a former bomber pilot, commander of a bomber. So we're glad that he's joining us. We should probably get started.
Well, let's ready.
I am ready. I think I'm ready. I'm ready. I just want to make sure you heard it.
Well, yeah, because the first one was a little lame. It was like
there's some sort of filter that filters it out. I have to give it a few.
So. All right, go ahead.
Okay. Wednesday of this week marks the 80th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and on Tuesday, day after tomorrow, historian Garrett Graff comes out with a new book, which he is being published, and it's called "The Devil Reached Towards the Sky: An Oral History of the Making and Unleashing of the Atomic Bomb." And Garrett, who's joining us today, is a journalist, historian, producer, and speaker. He appeared on History Happy Hour to talk about his D-Day oral history, When the Sea Came Alive. And I should also mention that his book, Watergate: A New History, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is also the author of The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history of 9/11. He taught at Georgetown University for 7 years, and he lives in Montpelier, Vermont. Garrett, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, so where are you? We said where we were. Where are you?
I am actually in New York City, New York today, starting the book tour for this, which comes out, as you said, on Tuesday.
All right. Well, I know we're not your first interview, but we're glad to be here early. And did you bring a cocktail?
I did. It is not in the glassware that I normally prefer to drink, but I have poured myself a Nika whiskey here, Japanese whiskey, to be on theme for the week.
Very good.
And Mr. Anderson, do you have a cocktail?
Well, I finished all my scotch at Spoonfest, so it's cider tonight.
Okay.
Well,
I'm beer. Beer.
Beer.
Drinking a beer. Garrett, maybe we can start. Your book is a pretty massive book, so maybe we can start by asking you about the title of the book and why you decided to write it.
Sure. So as you mentioned, this is my third book-length volume of oral history. I did a book in 2019, The Only Plane in the Sky, about 9/11. That book, of course, came out at the 18th anniversary of 9/11, and it pulled together 500 voices, coast to coast, morning to night, across America, what 9/11 was like to live. And for me, that was sort of an important moment because 2019, of course, represents the 18th anniversary of 9/11. And so it was just at the beginning of when 9/11 began to slip from memory into history. You had the first servicemen and women deploying going through basic training and deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan to fight in wars that began before they were born. You had the first firefighter candidates in New York City applying to enter FDNY who had been born after the day where 343 members of the fire service were killed in the September 11th attacks. And at that sort of little hinge moment where we begin to approach world events as history rather than as living memory, there's a tendency to make these events seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than they actually felt to anyone who lived them at the time. The story that we tell of 9/11 is, the whole thing begins at 8:46 in the morning on the East Coast in the US. The whole thing's over 102 minutes later with the collapse of the second tower. There are 4 planes, 4 attacks, 3,000 people die. And for those of us who were alive on 9/11, that's not the day that any of us actually remembered living. We didn't know when the attacks began. We didn't know when the attacks were over. We didn't know how many attacks there had been. And we didn't know what came next. We didn't know what would come on the afternoon of September 11th. We didn't know what would come in October in 2002. And so if you only read about 9/11 in the history books, what you miss is the fear, the chaos, the confusion, and the trauma that it was to actually experience those attacks. And if you miss the fear, the chaos, the confusion, and the trauma, you actually just don't understand why America responded to the 9/11 attacks in the way that we did, because we responded to them being driven by that fear, the chaos, the confusion, and the trauma. So here at World War II right now, we're at the opposite end of that historical arc. I think we're marking these 80th anniversaries over the last couple of years. D-Day last year, the atomic bombing, and the end of the war with Japan this month. I think with sort of a special poignancy because they also mark, and you two know this even better than me, we're sort of also having this moment where we're marking the unofficial passing of the last members of the greatest generation. And so we are at this moment where World War II is slipping permanently from living memory into history. And so my goal, both with the D-Day book last year and then this Manhattan Project atomic bomb book this year, is to draw upon the fact that we have effectively at this moment every first person memory we are ever going to have about World War II. and that narrative history is wonderful. I love narrative history. There are a gazillion wonderful narrative histories of World War II, but there's a special power that comes in oral history of letting you go back to these moments to experience them in the voices of the people who lived them at a moment where they don't know the outcome. So a big part of this book for me was to try to go back to the moments where, you know, the scientists, the physicists, the generals, the soldiers, the airmen didn't know what the outcome of World War II was going to be, didn't know whether Hitler would get the atomic bomb first, didn't know whether an atomic bomb would work at all. And then also, I think in the memories that we have now of the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to try to capture the confusion that they felt in a moment where they did not understand what was happening to their world. Now we know that we dropped an atomic bomb on them. Now that's a piece of history that we understand. But if you were in Hiroshima that day, if you were in Nagasaki on August 9th, if you were one of the doctors and physicians who were treating the wounded and the radiation poisoning afterward, you had no idea what was happening to your patients. And so for me, a big part of trying to do this project was to capture all of that uncertainty and put people back in the footsteps and the experiences of the people who really lived the Manhattan Project before they understood what would actually happen to the Manhattan Project.
So Garrett, you talk very eloquently at the start of the book about America's production and gearing up for war, and you go into some detail about the aircraft being produced and how they're important. But then you say of the 50,000 airplanes that were made, there are only two that really matter, or two that are remembered. And obviously, I think most of our viewers know which two planes, but which are the two planes, and what is it about, I guess, that moment, right? That those are the only two planes that matter, that those are the two names that resonate.
Yeah. And I'm sure that there are people on this live stream right now and listening to the podcast later who are going to say, well, what about the Memphis Belle? Yeah. What about this plane or the other plane? There are probably people in this community who can name 5 or 6 World War II planes. But it's just so striking. This is a story I talk about in the context of the in the introduction of the book, that when we think about World War II, we think about the battlefields, we think about the places where you guys lead tours, that we think of Leyte Gulf, we think of Midway, we think of Okinawa, we think of Bastogne, we think of Omaha Beach. And that's where World War II was fought. But it was won in the industrial might that the United States was able to bring to bear on the war. That was what makes the sort of ultimate difference in the war. And that it was, the Ford Motor Company factory at Willow Run manufacturing bombers. It was the factories of the Higgins industry in New Orleans making landing craft, and the shipyards, turning out more ships than sort of anyone thought possible. One of my sort of favorite statistics from the research in this book is at the end of World War II, the US Navy has more destroyers than the Japanese Air Force or the Japanese military has carrier aircraft, which is just like a tremendous level of mismatch of industrial might. And then you have the places like Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project factories at Oak Ridge and Hanford. And that's where the code breaking at Bletchley Park, that, this war is really won in the inventions that the United States and the Allies bring to bear. The radar, the proximity fuse, the atom bomb. And so for me, a big part of this book was trying to tell that story of industrial might and industrial power, because I think so often we over romanticize the story of the Manhattan Project as sort of J. Robert Oppenheimer and a couple of physicists in a lab in Los Alamos, New Mexico, who were important, don't get me wrong. But the thing that America does that no other country in the world can do in 1942, 43, 44, and 45 is build the secret cities at Oak Ridge and Hanford, where we take this land that is, you know, remote Tennessee, mountain valleys, a desert in eastern Washington, and build cities that employ 100,000 people apiece to refine the uranium and the plutonium necessary to build these bombs. You know, at the beginning of the war, plutonium exists. Plutonium has never been seen by the naked human eye. It literally only exists in microscopic amounts. And even at that stage, you have physicists at the University of Chicago beginning to map out on paper how to build factories that are going to manufacture it at the level of kilograms, which is just an incredible level of audacity. In the summer of 1945, when the atom bomb is dropped, August 6, 1945, the bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, is one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States. And it serves a city that does not exist anywhere on a public map, and it's a city that no one knows exists in the first place.
So all of that behind the planes, right, and the Enola Gay and Boxcar that dropped the atomic bomb. I want to come back to Oak Ridge and Hannaford, because I think that those are really interesting, and you devote a big part of the book to them. But you have a quote from, I mean, first of all, I just say the scope of this book is incredible. You start with a chapter that starts at 51 BC, right? So so from 51 BC to, let's say, 1930 is a page or two, and then it's really getting into stuff. But it really is a large scope. But you have a quote from a Hungarian scientist, Leo Szilard, who worked on the bomb project, actually helped Eisenhower write the letter to Roosevelt, which some people feel kind of got the U.S. started on the bomb project. And Leo Szilard said, if Congress knew the true history of the atomic energy project, I have no doubt that it would create a special medal to be given to meddling foreigners for distinguished services. So how important and who were these meddling foreigners? And some of them were people who'd literally been driven out of Germany by the policies of Adolf Hitler, right?
Absolutely. And I think, to me, this, again, this is all about sort of going back to what the experiences of these people actually were in those moments and in those years, where we immediately think of the atom bomb now in the context of Japan. You know, we immediately associate it with the war in the Pacific. But the story of the Manhattan Project, the story of the atom bomb, really begins in Europe and really is the product of the war with Adolf Hitler. And it is this group of mostly Jewish refugee scientists fleeing the enveloping cloak of fascism across the 1930s, coming to the UK, to Canada, to the US to escape Adolf Hitler's Europe, who arrive on our shores terrified that Hitler's going to build this bomb. You know, they are contemporaries, friends, colleagues of Werner Heisenberg and his team of physicists who they assume are back at work in Germany on an atomic bomb to serve Hitler. And that they spend sort of 2 years really pushing the US government to embark on this effort, you know, to take this seriously. And they can't get the military interested, they can't get the government interested. And they, as you said, Szilard and Edward Teller and some others end up sort of pushing Albert Einstein to write a letter to Franklin Roosevelt to try to jumpstart this. It still doesn't move as quickly as they would want, and it's only on December 6th, 1941, Saturday, December 6th.
Oh, that's
the U.S.
day before a famous day.
Yeah. Yes, that the U.S. officially launches a big, big effort that grows into what we now know as the Manhattan Project. But to me, there's this sort of incredible quote from a year later, sort of fall of 1942, where this team at the Met Lab in the University of Chicago is building, the first chain reactor to sort of prove that you can build a chain reacting reactor. And one of the scientists shows up early for his shift and says, look, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere in Europe, someone, Hitler's at work on a bomb. And if Hitler's at work, I should be at work. And like, that was really the thing that drove so many of these people was, nothing to do with Japan, but all about Adolf Hitler.
Yeah. So Garrett, we got a question, and I'm going to try to get it up here, from Lynn, who is always asked great questions. And Lynn wants to know who first conceived of the idea of an atomic bomb.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the sort of short, semi-unexpected answer is H.G. Wells, who in his
was he on the team working on
laser
this?
beams?
Yeah. Who sort of first conceives of something that we would now call an atomic bomb, and then a big part of this book ends up being how these ideas sort of emerge collectively over the course of the 1930s in Europe, in the United States, really growing out of the discovery of nuclear fission. And Szilard, who you talked about, sort of, he has, he's one of the early thinkers of the atomic bomb. And then actually sort of there's this amazing quote in the book that about how after word of the possibility of nuclear fission makes it to Berkeley for the first time in the fall of 1939, within a week, J. Robert Oppenheimer has a diagram of a bomb on his office wall. And even though it ends up being basically 3 years until he takes the place in the Manhattan Project that we now associate him with.
So, Rick, can I?
Yeah, go please.
So, Jarek, one of the things, it's almost kind of a stock answer. I'm sure Rick does it too. But whenever you're on tour, you always talk about how unprepared the U.S. Army was for World War II and how bad the Navy was. But one of the things that I found really fascinating in the book was you go into a fair amount of depth about how unprepared we were scientifically for the war.
Yes.
And since so much of what you talk about is our ability to, the brain power, to tell our viewers how unprepared were we scientifically for what was about to happen.
Yeah, and this ends up being, when we talk about the legacy of the Manhattan Project, to me, actually, probably the most important thing that the Manhattan Project does is not the atomic bomb. It's the way that it rewrites the relationship between the U.S. government and science. And that, and it wasn't just the Manhattan bomb, the Rad Lab at MIT and the work that they did on developing radar, the development of the proximity fuse. But coming into World War II, there was no sense in the U.S. government or the U.S. military that science and technology represented a core source of national strength. and that Chris and Rick, you probably know the stats better than I do. Like, we come into World War II with like an army roughly the size of Portugal,
Romania,
and,
yeah,
and
13th largest,
sort of et cetera, et cetera. But what is so striking about the 2 years of these meetings between these scientists and the military is just the military doesn't care. Like, that they're sitting there and they're like, what are you science folks doing in a meeting with me? I'm a super important colonel in charge of procurement. Like, what do there's this one scene where Szilard, Teller, a couple of others are meeting after that Einstein Roosevelt letter with a group of military officials in Washington, and the colonels in the meeting interrupt the presentation by these, again, refugee physicists,
Nobel Prize winners, etc. Yeah.
Exactly. To say two things. One officer says, wars aren't won with weapons; they're won with morale and basically morality, and like us being the better moral cause is the thing that will let us win World War II. And then one of the other colonels interrupts and dismisses the idea of an atomic bomb and says, I'm offering a $10,000 reward for anyone who can build a death ray that can kill a goat tied to a post. Basically, him saying, I think that a death ray is more likely to appear in reality than an atomic bomb. And that it really takes the U.S. and it takes Vannevar Bush and other leaders to begin to sort of knit together the idea that, no, actually, like, the science and technology here can be a really important part of the war effort. And of course, after the war, this becomes, I would argue, sort of the core source of American economic strength, educational achievement, economic prosperity, and sort of our global superpower status after the war. And that to me is part of what I think makes the Manhattan Project such a fascinating moment. Is it's not just the end of World War II. It is the start of something new and different in the post-war age as well.
I love the death ray comment, and I love it especially because there's in Britain in the 1930s, there's a scientist named Robert Watson Watt who is contacted by the government, and they say, we're concerned that Hitler may be developing a death ray to hit Great Britain with. And he says, and can you tell us, is this possible? What can we do? And he does some calculations and he says, well, no, it's not really possible, so don't worry about it. However, he says, there is a less unpromising possibility that we could use radio wave to detect oncoming airplanes. And from this comes the development in Britain of radar, which then leads to the whole system that they have for defending Britain from the German aerial attacks in 1940 and 41, et cetera. But that was also born from a death ray. So, and I think we've probably talked about that on the show before. It is one of my favorite stories. I'll bring it out anytime I get a chance to.
Like you just did.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay.
There's so
you
many.
You had a question, Rick.
There's so many things that we can ask about, and I'm like looking at my question list, going, where I'm not going to get 1/5 of these in. But you have a quote from an Army officer. You were talking about some colonels. So here's a colonel, Colonel Kenneth Nichols, and he ran a big chunk of the atomic bomb effort. kind of running Oak Ridge in Hannaford, I think. And he's talking about General Leslie Groves, the Army general who ran the Manhattan Project. And here's what he says. He says, General Groves is the biggest SOB that I have ever worked for. He is most demanding. He is most critical. He is always a driver, never a praiser. He is abrasive and sarcastic. He disregards all normal organizational channels. He constantly meddled with my subordinates. And if I had to do my part of the atomic bomb project over again and had the privilege of picking my boss, I would pick General Groves. So talk a little bit about Leslie Groves, and who is the guy who, I guess, herds the cats during the atomic bomb project.
Yeah. So General Groves, this is of course Matt Damon's character from the movie. He is the deputy chief of construction for the Army Corps of Engineers, and in 41 is leading the construction of the Pentagon. Which was being built right at the start of the war, world's largest office building, enormous, huge construction undertaking. And he ends up sort of learning about the edges of the Manhattan Project, because sort of some of the paperwork has to come through his project, come through his office. And then over the course of the spring of 1942, the scientists are off working on the Manhattan Project themselves, and they get to a point where sort of real money is going to need to be put into this. And, you're going to need to start to build these cities and build these factories and build these laboratories. And it's decided that it should be handed over to the Army Corps of Engineers. And then in the fall, Colonel Groves at that time is about to be deployed over to Europe, which is what he wants, which is to finally sort of go and actually, do something in the war. And he's sort of pulled out of a congressional hearing and, asked to come in and meet with, the head of the engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers. And he basically is like, if this is about you guys giving me the project that I think you're going to give me, I don't want it. Because he thinks, sort of like many people, not unlike the Colonel in the Death Ray, that there's sort of not much likelihood that the atom bomb will appear in time to help end the war. And so he thinks that there's sort of more valuable stuff that he can be doing. But he ends up taking control. He gets promoted to brigadier general as part of it, major general in the middle of the war, middle of the Manhattan Project, and really becomes this incredible force on the project. And he leads it sort of alongside Robert Oppenheimer. It's a little bit more complicated than that in an org chart, but they're sort of the two people that we sort of consider the leaders of the Manhattan Project. And he, I think probably more than anyone else in the U.S. military, in the U.S. government, and probably in the project as a whole, is the one who ends up being responsible for the success of the Manhattan Project.
So, Garrett, speaking of, kind of picking up on Groves, you've touched on this already about kind of the size of, say, Los Alamos and some of the other plants. And what I find so staggering is the size and scope of this thing on something that, as this colonel pointed out, it's kind of like a death ray, right? It's a very small group of people that can conceive of something like this. But can you touch on some kind of facts and figures? What is the size and scale and scope of this thing that we're committing ourselves to, again,
without knowing if it's going to work?
Right, without knowing if it's going to work, right? And how is this all kept under wraps?
Yeah. It's a couple of different things. The total project ends up being in the neighborhood of about $2 billion, which even today would be a lot of money, but certainly in World War II was a tremendous amount of money. I get into actually in the book a little bit how they actually fund it, because it's basically funded without the knowledge of virtually anyone in the government, without virtually anyone in Congress.
Yeah, how do you hide $2 billion?
And basically the answer was Henry Stimson and George Marshall and a couple of other high-ranking folks went directly to the appropriations committees on the Hill. It was a different time on Capitol Hill.
Right.
And they would say, we're going to tell you, the chairman, about this. We're going to assure you that we need this money, and you can't ask any more questions about it. And that ends up sort of carrying them through the war. It ends up employing literally hundreds of thousands of people.
It's something like 200,000 people, right? I mean, when you add it all up, or 250,000?
I would say probably more north of the 250 range. Wow. Because there are 100,000 apiece in
Oak Ridge and Hanford.
In Oak Ridge and Hanford. Los Alamos is sort of 6,000 to 8,000 people. And then you have lots of other facilities across the country. I mean, part of what, again, you talk about the industrial might of this, DuPont, the American industrial firm, ends up being a huge part of this. Tennessee Eastman, sort of division of Eastman Kodak, is the main operator of the Oak Ridge facilities. And you've got the Met Lab at the University of Chicago, facilities all around the country. Almost none of them know what they're actually doing. I mean, sort of part of the way that the secret holds is the number of people who really understand what is taking place at any of these facilities is incredibly tiny. They did, when they were constructing these facilities in Oak Ridge and Hanford, there would be, I'm slightly oversimplifying this for the purposes of conversation, but there was like a secret room that held all the real blueprints. And only like a small number of draftsmen would be in the main room with all the blueprints for these facilities. And the foreman would sort of come in, and the draftsman would give them, one sheet of paper that sort of gives them like this tiny box of stuff that they are supposed to build next. And then they would come back and get a different sheet of paper with like the next little set of things that they're supposed to build. And so sort of at that level, basically, they were able to keep most of the construction plans unclassified, because no one really knew what was even being constructed in like the next room, let alone, what their machines were actually doing. In Oak Ridge, which was the main site for the uranium refinement and processing, they built, thousands of these calutrons, which are the machines to refine and process the uranium. And there's this wonderful story about how most of the labor crew there were young high school girls from Tennessee. That was who you could hire in 43 and 44 in most of the United States, were sort of, young high school graduates, females. This is where you sort of get your Rosie the Riveter icon. And Tennessee Eastman, says, here's who we're going to hire to do all of this work. And, the Berkeley PhDs who are sort of planning the facility are like, there's no way a high schooler can learn how to do this. And then they do a head-to-head test, and the high school graduate women that Tennessee Eastman has hired actually outperform the Berkeley PhDs in uranium refinement. And they sort of come to be known as the Calutron girls. They run shifts 24 hours a day for better part of 2 years to get this plutonium or this uranium ready. And most of the workers at Oak Ridge learn the word uranium for the first time on August 6, 1945, when Harry Truman announces the existence of the Manhattan Project. That sort of these people, worked these calutrons, processed all of this uranium without ever actually knowing what the thing was that their machines did and sort of how it contributed or what it contributed to the overall war effort.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of the things that was amazing is that you have, say, 100,000 people working at Oak Ridge for a couple of years, and they are basically making 100 pounds or 200 pounds of uranium. I mean, and that is the output for 100. And the people in Hanford, Washington, are making a few pounds, 5 pounds or something of plutonium. I mean, some tiny amount. There's so much we're kind of skipping over, and you talked about the role of women, and I think we're not going to be able to talk about that today, but that's an amazing part of the story. A lot of people probably know the name Paul Tibbets. He was most famous as the pilot of the Enola Gay, but I was amazed at, first of all, at how young he is at this time. He's 28 or 29 when he gets involved with this. I mean, he's almost 10 years younger than either of my kids. And also amazed at how much responsibility he is given. I mean, I don't know exactly how long it was, maybe a year or something before the bomb is actually dropped. Can you talk a little bit about Paul Tibbets?
Yeah. So one of the things that you sort of have to understand as you get into this is, like, the Enola Gay and Paul Tibbets is not the randomly assigned air crew in Tinian on the morning of August 6th who's next up on the duty roster and just happens to get the atomic bomb. Paul Tibbets is, arguably, and I'm sure there are people on this live stream who would be happy to argue this, but he is
they'll argue anything. Yeah.
For all intents and purposes, he is the best bomber pilot in the U.S. Air Force in World War II. And he has this hugely successful bombing career in Europe, comes back to the United States basically to launch the B-29 program, is in charge of sort of helping to work out the first round of training for the B-29 pilots, which he sort of does in this amazing way where it's an early plane. There are all sorts of the normal gremlins, one has in early planes. The B-29 sort of starts to get this bad reputation. And men are starting to refuse to fly it. They're sort of too scared to fly the B-29. And so what Paul Tibbets does is he goes down south to a WASP detachment, the Women Air Service pilots, and finds 2 women, spends a couple of days teaching them how to fly a B-29. They succeed, and then flies this B-29 around to all the B-29 bases so that this plane, comes in, lands, and then these women pop out of the cockpit, and at which point all the male B-29 pilots in training are too embarrassed by the idea that, well, if a woman can fly it, then I have to be able to fly it too, that sort of all the resistance to the B-29 melts away. And it's just this incredibly funny and odd story of sort of how the B-29 comes into existence as the main bomber in the war on Japan. And then as he sort of wraps up that, he is given he's sort of pulled aside and given a briefing on the Manhattan Project for the first time, and told that he is going to stand up a unit, what comes to be known as the 509th Bomb Composite Group, that is effectively Paul Tibbets's private air force within an air force. And he's got a B-29 combat wing. He's got, logistics, flight support, training support, aviation support, military police, sort of the whole thing, everything that you would need. And they train for about 9 months on just how to drop an atomic bomb. Of course, Paul Tibbets and only a small handful of people actually know that what they're training for is an atomic bomb. That what they are, but they go up and they drop these huge mock bombs. They're called pumpkins, that are sort of 10,000 pound mock-ups of what the finished atomic bomb will look like. And then they develop this sort of radical dropping technique, because they need to be 8 miles away from the explosion in order to survive the explosion. And so what they end up doing is, when they drop the bomb, the plane then goes into a sort of like 155 degree bank turn to sort of get as far away from the bomb explosion as possible. And it's just this sort of tremendously complex operation. It's all the personnel, it's the management, it's the training, all of it resting on Paul Tibbets's shoulders. And then he takes the unit to Tinian in the summer of 1945, where they train. They do a couple of sort of mock training runs against Japanese garrisons in the Pacific, and then ultimately end up having the bomb ready, and Tibbets flies that first atomic mission to Hiroshima.
So, Garrett, throughout this book, sort of the elephant in the room is the question of morality. And that's something that's a conversation that's ongoing. I'm sure we're going to get a lot more of it now with the anniversary coming up. But through the lens of, the people in your book and the quotes that they're giving us, the things that they're saying at the time, are any of these people pondering what's about to happen? Obviously a lot don't know, but those that have some inkling of it, are they contemplating this, or are they weighing it, and sort of how does that affect it?
So I think they end up falling into 3 categories. So let me talk about the 3 categories, and then let me talk about sort of the broader permission structure of the summer of 1945, which I think is an important part of the context. So the scientists really end up having sort of 3 camps of reaction to the bomb as it gets ready. The first are the people who say, look, I signed up to defeat Hitler, and the only thing that I'm annoyed about is that the bomb wasn't ready earlier. There's a whole camp in the Los Alamos team and elsewhere who, as 45 unfolds, they'd really hoped the bomb was going to be ready in 44, and that they were going to be able to drop it on Berlin, and that they had no qualms about dropping it on Berlin and, trying to end that war earlier and faster and with less American bloodshed. But that they don't have any interest in dropping the bomb on Japan. That in their mind, Japan was not the reason they got into this project, and they don't want to see it dropped. The second category are people who are thrilled is probably an overstatement, but there is a camp of scientists who are, really see this weapon as something that helps change the course of the war. And, you have to remember, World War II, there are all sorts of family members who are wrapped up in this war too. And so for a lot of them, they are celebrating the use of the bomb because they can name the people whose lives it saves. There's one woman that I quote, who, is celebrating on August 6, 1945, when word comes that the atomic bomb has been used successfully on Hiroshima, because she's thinking of her brother, who is a Marine flamethrower, who'd been part of the Okinawa invasion and is set to be in the second wave of the invasion of the Japanese home islands, later in 45 or early 46, whenever it happens. And so, she knows, like, her brother is alive because the bomb is, making the war shorter. And then there's sort of a third group that I think sort of look at this in the context of what World War II really was, which was the deadliest conflict in world history. 60 million people die in the course of World War II, 45 million civilians, 15 million combatants, death and tragedy at a scale where even today we, round off the number of Chinese dead to the closest couple million. And that over the course of the spring of 1945, the deadliest thing that happens in Japan is not the atomic bomb. It's Operation Meeting House and the firebombing of Tokyo, where Curtis LeMay and these B-29s and other bombers, level, huge swaths of Tokyo, kill 100,000 Japanese in the course of a single night, and then go on to bomb a total of 66 cities, destroying 50, 60, 70% of the city in a single night. So much so that the US government and the war planners actually have to save, quote unquote, cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the firebombing in order for the atomic bomb to be used on them, because we know that the atomic bomb would, if the cities had been firebombed first, there wouldn't have been enough of the city left to actually even, be able to destroy it with an atom bomb. And, I think a lot of people look at this as something that saved American lives. I think in a very cold, terrible calculus, it saved Japanese lives as well. I mean, again, when we think about that summer of 45, most people don't think about how that naval blockade was starving the Japanese population. You have 200,000 Japanese dying every month in the summer heading into the fall of 45 of starvation. And that, I think, you couldn't ever possibly say that the atom bombs were a rounding error on the end of World War II. But if the atom bombs had never been dropped, we would still say there were 60 million people who died in World War II. Like, I mean, just the scale of this tragedy is so enormous. All of that said, I think it is really important, and a big part of why I wanted to do this book, and a big part of what I hope readers take away from this book, is the understanding that nuclear weapons are not just like any other weapon in the human arsenal, that they are a fundamentally different level of destruction. They are weapons that kill communities and civilizations, and that, there's a reason that the central organizing principle of geopolitics for the 8 decades since has been to avoid ever using these bombs again.
Yeah, and we haven't really even talked about it, but you paint a great picture of destruction in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which almost wasn't bombed, right? Because it was not on the it was not number one on the bombing list that morning, and it was a sort of a secondary target. You talk in the book about the people who were bombed twice, the 150 or so people who survived, I think, but who were in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it is a sort of a story of monumental scale, and there's lots in the book that I think will be of great interest to anybody who's interested in this. Somebody asked us what's new or different in this book from what we thought or knew before, and I think for me it was the level of detail, and as you say, understanding the idea of kind of what people thought in the moment, as opposed to kind of wrapping it all up with a bow and saying what it looked like afterwards.
Well, and I also think it's the massive perspectives, right, that you don't usually get. 500
different people looking at it, and you get any three people are going to look at something differently. So when you get 500 people, it's going to be pretty amazing. Garrett Graff, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate that, and for talking about your book, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky. We never did find out where the title came from, so you're just going to have to read through the book and find that quote. It's in there. But thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour.
Thanks, Garrett.
Thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you.
All right, cheers.
Good night.
Good night.
Wow, it's a sobering book,
yes.
and there are this tremendous variety of points of view in it, and also characters that you've never heard of, and the role that they played, sometimes very important roles. So, pretty amazing. Next week, Chris, we are going to bring back another HHH alum. To talk about his book. I actually where did I put it?
It's probably behind your Ghost Army book. Right?
Oh, it's in the bedroom. No, it's Keith Lowe. He's going to talk about his book Naples 1944, Excellent. The Devil's Paradise at War, and I know you're a big Keith Lowe fan.
I am.
Yeah, you can do the introduction next week.
There you go. Happy to.
I grant you that. I mean, ooh. Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Blue Sky, listen to our podcast, back us on patreon.com, please, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Today I am going to play the close.